December 1945, Camp Angel Island, San Francisco Bay. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the mess hall doorway, his hands trembling as he watched American soldiers pile food onto metal trays with a casualness that seemed almost obscene. Mountains of potatoes, entire chicken legs, fresh bread stacked like firewood. He had survived 4 years of combat in the Pacific, 3 weeks adrift in a lifeboat after his destroyer went down, and 2 months in a temporary holding facility, eating rice portions that could fit in a teacup. What he witnessed now seemed impossible. These Americans were treating their evening meal as if food itself was limitless, as if the very concept of scarcity was a foreign language they had never learned to speak. What Yamamoto and the other Japanese prisoners who arrived at California detention facilities in late 1945 could not comprehend was that their entire understanding of modern warfare, of industrial capacity, and of what a nation could produce had been built on a foundation of lies. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 6 months, these men would experience a transformation so profound that many would question everything they had been taught about their enemy, their mission, and the very nature of the conflict they had fought. Yamamoto had commanded a patrol boat in the Solomon Islands, where his crew had subsisted on half rations for the final year of operations. Rice mixed with tree bark, seaweed soup that was more water than substance. Once, memorably, they had celebrated when supply runners managed to deliver dried fish that was only partially spoiled. His crew had been told repeatedly that America was suffering, that their supply lines were stretched impossibly thin, that victory was inevitable because the soft Americans could never match Japanese discipline and sacrifice. Standing in that California mess hall, watching a young private who could not have been older than 19 pile a second helping of roast beef onto his tray while complaining to his companion that the gravy was not hot enough, Yamamoto felt something crack inside his certainty. Captain Robert Henderson had overseen prisoner facilities since early 1944, first in Hawaii and now at the newly established camps in California. He had processed over 3,000 Japanese military personnel, and he had seen the same expression on nearly every face during those first meals. It was not hunger, though they were certainly hungry. It was something deeper, disbelief, cognitive dissonance, the visible shattering of a worldview. Henderson had been specifically instructed by his superiors to ensure that prisoners received the same rations as American servicemen, as required by the Geneva Convention. What his superiors perhaps had not fully appreciated was the psychological impact this would have. The standard American military ration in late 1945 included 3,200 calories per day, protein from multiple sources, fresh vegetables when available, coffee, sugar, bread made from refined flour. The Japanese military ration for frontline troops in the final year of the conflict had averaged, when available at all, around 1,500 calories per day, mostly rice, occasionally dried fish or pickled vegetables. Many units had received far less. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura had been captured in the Philippines in January 1945. He had kept a careful diary throughout his service, a practice technically forbidden but widely ignored. His entry from his 3rd day at the California facility read simply, "Today we received meat, real meat, in quantities I have not seen since before the conflict began. The Americans give this to prisoners, to enemies. I do not understand what this means. I do not understand anything anymore." The transformation Henderson observed was not immediate. For the first week, most prisoners ate cautiously, suspiciously. Several became physically ill, their systems unable to process the sudden influx of fats and proteins after years of deprivation. Some refused to eat at all, convinced it was a trick, that the food was poisoned, or that accepting it represented some form of moral surrender beyond their military defeat. Private First Class James Morrison worked in the Camp Angel Island mess facility, helping to prepare and serve meals to over 800 prisoners. He was from Iowa, had grown up on a farm where his family had weathered the Depression by producing almost everything they consumed. He understood scarcity in a way many of his coastal counterparts did not. Yet even Morrison, who had known lean times, could not fully grasp what he was witnessing. "They look at the food like it's gold," Morrison wrote to his sister. "Yesterday, one of them, an officer I think based on how the others treat him, asked me through the translator how much of my monthly wages I had spent to purchase my lunch. When I told him I didn't pay anything, that this was just standard military food, he didn't believe me. Thought the translator had made an error. He asked 3 times, getting more confused each time." The cultural revelation worked in multiple directions. While the Japanese prisoners struggled to comprehend American material abundance, the American guards and administrators began to understand, through thousands of small interactions, just how comprehensive the privation had been on the other side. Commander David Foster, the camp's chief medical officer, conducted intake examinations on each arriving prisoner. His reports painted a stark picture. The average weight of Japanese military personnel arriving at California facilities was 118 pounds, for men whose average height was 5 feet 4 inches. Many showed signs of chronic malnutrition, beriberi from thiamine deficiency, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, dental problems that suggested years without adequate nutrition. "I examined a pilot yesterday," Foster wrote in his official report dated January 15, 1946. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, age 24. He had flown combat missions for 3 years. His weight was 103 pounds. He told me, through the translator, that he had been considered healthy by his unit's medical officer. Healthy? At 103 pounds. He was not being ironic. He genuinely believed this was normal, that his condition was acceptable for military service. The contrast became even more pronounced during the holiday season. The camp administrators, following standard military tradition, organized a special meal for Christmas: turkey, ham, multiple side dishes, desserts including pie and cake. The quantities were not extravagant by American standards, simply a slightly enhanced version of the typical fare. For the prisoners, it represented something beyond comprehension. Lieutenant Yamamoto was selected by the other prisoners to speak with Captain Henderson through the interpreter, a Japanese-American linguist named Thomas Fujita, who had served with distinction in the military intelligence service. The conversation, recorded in Henderson's daily log, revealed the depth of the cultural chasm. "Lieutenant Yamamoto wishes to understand," Fujita translated, "if this special meal is a reward for good behavior or cooperation." Henderson shook his head. "No reward, it's just Christmas. A holiday. We do this every year." A long pause while Fujita translated. Yamamoto's response was extensive, his tone measured but intense. "Lieutenant Yamamoto says," Fujita began, then paused, recalibrating. "He says that in his final year of service, his entire unit shared 3 chickens for New Year, their most important holiday. 72 men, 3 chickens. They considered this a blessing, a sign that conditions were improving. He wants to know how many chickens were prepared today." Henderson checked his supply records. For 800 prisoners, about 350 chickens, plus the turkeys, maybe 200 of those. The translator delivered this information. Yamamoto's face remained carefully neutral, but his hands, Henderson noted, were shaking. "He asks," Fujita continued quietly, "if this is normal for American military facilities." "Yes," Henderson confirmed. "This is standard, maybe a bit extra for the holiday, but not dramatically different from any other week." What Henderson could not fully articulate, what perhaps no single conversation could convey, was the industrial reality behind those numbers. American food production in 1945 had been operating at levels that would have seemed fantastical just a decade earlier. Mechanized farming, hybrid crops, industrial-scale meat production, a transportation network that could move fresh food thousands of miles, an economy that, despite supporting over 12 million people in military service and supplying allies around the globe, had never implemented food rationing as severe as Britain's, and nothing remotely approaching the starvation conditions that had prevailed in Germany or Japan. The United States had produced over 300 million tons of food in 1945, for a population of 140 million people, plus military forces, plus substantial exports to allies. The mathematics were straightforward, but the implications were staggering. Sergeant Nakamura, whose diary had become an informal chronicle for several of the prisoners who gathered to hear his observations each evening, wrote extensive entries about what he called the American paradox. "They are simultaneously careless and generous with everything," he noted in late January. "I watched a young soldier yesterday throw away half a sandwich because he said the bread was slightly stale." Slightly stale. "I have eaten bread that was more fungus than flour. I have been grateful for it." This same soldier later shared his chocolate ration with 3 of us without being asked, as if it cost him nothing, as if sweetness itself was so common that sharing it required no sacrifice whatsoever. The chocolate observation was particularly significant. The American military had distributed chocolate rations to troops throughout the conflict, not as a rare luxury, but as a standard morale item. The Hershey's tropical bar had been specifically designed to withstand high temperatures. Over 3 billion of these bars had been produced during the conflict years. 3 billion. Captain Ichiro Tanaka had served in logistics for the Imperial Forces in the Philippines. His job had been supply coordination, making impossible decisions about which units would receive the inadequate provisions that trickled through disrupted supply lines. He understood numbers, he understood systems. What he could not understand was how any nation could function at the scale he was now witnessing. "They waste more than we had to distribute," Tanaka said during one of the informal discussion groups that Henderson had authorized, believing that allowing prisoners to process their experiences openly would ease the transition. "I coordinated supplies for 15,000 men. On a good month, I had perhaps 40 tons of rice, some dried fish, occasional vegetables. I was considered effective because I could stretch these portions to prevent starvation. Yesterday I learned that this single facility, housing 800 prisoners, receives 30 tons of food every week. Every week, just for prisoners, for enemies." Thomas Fujita, the translator, found himself in a unique position. As a second-generation Japanese-American who had grown up in Los Angeles, he straddled both worlds. He had visited relatives in Japan as a child before the conflict. He had also experienced the internment of Japanese Americans early in the conflict, though his military service had eventually provided a path forward. He understood both the American abundance and the Japanese scarcity in ways that few others could. "The hardest part of my job," Fujita confided to Henderson during a quiet moment, "is not the language translation. It's translating concepts that don't exist in both worlds. How do I explain a cafeteria to someone who has never seen food treated casually? How do I convey unlimited refills to men who measured their rice rations in spoonfuls?" The psychological impact manifested in unexpected ways. Some prisoners became obsessive about not wasting anything, carefully saving portions, unable to believe that more food would actually arrive the next day. Others experienced something approaching grief, mourning the comrades who had perished from privation while such abundance existed elsewhere in the world. Private First Class Yuki Matsuda, who had been captured in Okinawa, spent 2 weeks collecting leftover bread crusts until the guards discovered a cache of over 50 pieces in his bunk. When confronted, he became distraught, explaining through tears that his younger brother had perished from starvation in New Guinea, that he could not bear to see food discarded when his brother had suffered so terribly. Henderson arranged for Matsuda to work in the camp garden, growing vegetables. The physical work and the tangible connection to food production seemed to help. Within a month, Matsuda was eating normally and had stopped hoarding, but not all transformations were painful. As weeks became months, many prisoners began to relax into the reality of their situation. They gained weight, their health improved, and with physical recovery came psychological shifts that Henderson found fascinating to observe. Lieutenant Yamamoto began attending the voluntary English classes that had been organized. His motivation, he explained to Fujita, was practical. He wanted to be able to ask questions without translation, to understand directly. But the questions he asked revealed a mind grappling with profound revisions of belief. "In these classes," Yamamoto said during one session, "we learned about American farming. The teacher said a single farmer with machines can cultivate 300 acres. In Japan, my family's farm was 2 acres, worked by my father, my uncle, and 4 laborers. This American teaching says 1 man with machines equals what would require 100 or more of our farmers. This seems impossible. But then I remember the food. And I think perhaps it is not impossible. Perhaps we never understood who we were fighting. The mechanical and industrial revelation extended beyond food. The camp had a small motor pool for maintenance vehicles. Some prisoners with mechanical experience were allowed to work there under supervision. Sergeant Toshiro Yamada, who had served as a mechanic in the Imperial Air Forces, was assigned to help maintain the camp's trucks. His reaction to the tools and equipment available was captured in a letter he wrote to his wife, though whether she ever received it from war-torn Japan was never confirmed. "The Americans have tools I've only seen in technical manuals," Yamada wrote. "Specialized equipment for every task. When something wears out, they replace it rather than improvising repairs. I watched them discard a wrench yesterday because the adjustment mechanism was stiff. Just threw it away. In my entire service, I had 4 wrenches for maintaining 12 aircraft. 4 wrenches for 12 aircraft. Here they have more tools than I can count just for maintaining 6 trucks." The cultural exchange was not entirely one-directional. The American personnel, particularly those who took time to interact with prisoners beyond the minimum required, began to develop a complex understanding of their former enemies as individuals rather than abstractions. Private Morrison, the mess worker from Iowa, struck up a tentative friendship with Corporal Saburo Ito, who had basic English skills from his education in Tokyo. Their conversations, initially about simple topics like weather and food, gradually deepened. "Ito told me about his family's restaurant in Tokyo," Morrison wrote to his sister in March. "How they had to close in 43 because there was no food to serve. How his mother tried to keep it going anyway, serving watered-down soup and rice that was more husk than grain. He described watching his younger sister grow thin, how helpless he felt. Then he asked me about farming in Iowa, and I told him about our harvest in 44, how we had so much corn we sold half and still had extra to feed livestock. He got very quiet. I realized he was doing math in his head, calculating what our one-farm surplus could have meant for his family. It was an awful moment, realizing how the accident of geography determines everything." Captain Henderson compiled monthly reports on the prisoner facilities operations. The statistics were straightforward: health outcomes, security incidents, work assignments. But his personal observations, recorded in a separate journal he kept, told a different story. Month 5 of operations, Henderson wrote in May 1946, "The physical transformation of the prisoners is remarkable. Average weight gain is 28 pounds, but the psychological transformation is more complex. Many have passed through denial and grief and arrived at something like acceptance or perhaps realization. Lieutenant Yamamoto told me yesterday that he finally understands why his nation could not win the conflict, not because of courage or spirit, but because they were fighting an economic reality that no amount of determination could overcome. He said it was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The bucket could be perfect, the technique flawless, the determination absolute, but the ocean remains the ocean." The technical demonstrations proved particularly impactful. In June, a documentary film crew visited the camp to record footage for training purposes. They brought with them reels of industrial footage showing American production facilities, steel mills, aircraft factories, shipyards where vessels were constructed in weeks rather than months. The screening was attended by over 300 prisoners. The reaction was profound silence. The footage showed the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford had produced B-24 bombers at the rate of 1 aircraft per hour during peak production. 1 per hour. The assembly line stretched for over a mile. The factory employed over 40,000 workers operating in coordinated shifts. After the screening, Commander Foster observed that several prisoners appeared to be in shock. One, a former pilot, sat motionless for over 20 minutes, staring at nothing. "I could not have stopped this," the pilot, Lieutenant Kenji Sato, finally said. "None of us could have stopped this. We fought against a machine that could produce weapons faster than we could dream of using them. I flew 27 combat missions. I was considered experienced, skilled. But what did my skill matter against a nation that could build aircraft like they were manufacturing automobiles? We were told we had the spiritual advantage, that our dedication would overcome their material advantage. But there is no spiritual force that can counter 30,000 aircraft. 30,000. I did not know such numbers were possible. The agricultural footage proved equally devastating. Vast fields harvested by machines, grain elevators that could hold more rice than his entire home prefecture produced in a year, cattle ranches that stretched for miles. One prisoner calculated that the single cattle ranch shown in the documentary contained more livestock than his entire home island. "We fought a war of rations against a nation that had abundance," Sergeant Nakamura wrote. "Every strategic decision we made, every sacrifice we endured, was based on the assumption that our enemies faced similar scarcity. We believed that if we could endure privation better, we would prevail. But they never faced true privation. Their civilians ate better during the conflict than our soldiers did. This is not a military defeat. This is a revelation that our entire understanding of the modern world was incorrect." As 1946 progressed, the camp population began to shift. Some prisoners were being processed for eventual repatriation to Japan. Though the logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of personnel across the Pacific was complex and slow, others remained in custody pending additional screening or due to medical conditions that required continued treatment. Lieutenant Yamamoto was among those scheduled for early repatriation. In his final days at Camp Angel Island, he requested a meeting with Captain Henderson. Fujita translated. "Lieutenant Yamamoto wishes to express something that is difficult to convey," Fujita began. "He says that when he arrived here, he hated Americans as enemies. He expected brutality because that is what he had been told to expect, and because that is what he knew he might have delivered in reverse circumstances. Instead, he found something he could not have anticipated. Not kindness exactly, but a kind of indifferent generosity. You treated us well not because you respected us or feared us, but because you could afford to, because treating prisoners well cost you nothing. Your abundance made compassion easy." Yamamoto continued speaking, his voice steady but intense. "He says," Fujita translated carefully, "that this is more devastating than any military loss. If you had been cruel, he could have maintained his beliefs. He could have returned home still believing in the righteousness of the conflict, still believing that the outcome was merely bad fortune or tactical errors. But you were not cruel. You were casually generous in a way that revealed the true scale of the disparity between our nations. He says he will return to Japan and tell the truth about what he saw, even though it will be difficult for others to believe. He says someone must help his people understand what kind of world actually exists beyond their shores." Henderson responded carefully. "Tell Lieutenant Yamamoto that I hope his country rebuilds successfully, that this conflict is ending, and whatever comes next should be better than what came before, and that the abundance he has seen here is not something to be feared or envied, but something that could be built anywhere with the right circumstances and enough time." The translation of this message sparked a longer conversation between Yamamoto and Fujita in Japanese. Finally, Fujita turned back to Henderson. "Lieutenant Yamamoto says that he hopes you are correct, that what he has witnessed here can be recreated rather than simply envied. He says that his country made many mistakes, but perhaps the greatest was believing that the modern world still operated by ancient rules, that spiritual strength could overcome material reality. He says the future must be built on different foundations." In the final weeks before the camp began large-scale repatriation operations, the psychological transformation Henderson had observed crystallized into something measurable. The camp offered voluntary discussion groups where prisoners could talk about their experiences and their concerns about returning home. Over 70% of eligible prisoners attended at least one session. The themes that emerged were remarkably consistent. Shame at how they had been deceived about enemy capabilities, anger at the leadership that had sent them into an unwinnable conflict, grief for comrades who had perished while such abundance existed elsewhere, but also, increasingly, a kind of tentative hope about what reconstruction might bring. Corporal Ito, Morrison's friend from the mess hall, put it directly during one session. "I spent 3 years hating Americans, but the Americans I actually met are not the demons we were told about. They are just people. People with better tools, better supplies, better systems. If we can learn from this, if we can build those systems for ourselves, then perhaps something worthwhile can come from all this suffering." The repatriation ships began departing in August 1946. Hundreds of former prisoners, healthier than they had been in years, returning to a homeland that was itself struggling with shortages and rebuilding. Many carried letters to families of American soldiers who had died in the Pacific, messages of condolence that Henderson had encouraged as part of the healing process. Some carried photographs of the camp, evidence of their treatment that they knew might seem unbelievable to those who had not witnessed it. Lieutenant Yamamoto was among the first group repatriated. His final action before boarding the transport ship was to present Henderson with a carefully written letter in English, which he had labored over for weeks with Fujita's help. The letter, which Henderson kept in his personal papers, read in part, "Captain Henderson, I came to your facility as a prisoner and an enemy. I leave as someone who has seen a different possibility for the future. The abundance I witnessed was not merely material, but represented a different way of organizing human effort. My country must learn this lesson, though it will be painful. I return home to help rebuild, to advocate for systems that can create abundance rather than manage scarcity. I do not thank you for my captivity, but I acknowledge that what I learned here was more valuable than what I learned in 4 years of combat. The conflict has ended. What matters now is what we build from the ruins." Commander Foster's final medical report on the camp's operations, submitted in September 1946 as the facility began transitioning to closure, documented the physical outcomes. Average weight gain of 27 pounds per prisoner. Dramatic reduction in malnutrition-related conditions. No deaths from illness in 8 months of operation, a remarkable statistic compared to prisoner facilities elsewhere in the world. But Foster's report also included an unusual section on psychological observations. The impact of adequate nutrition on mental health cannot be overstated, he wrote. But equally significant was the psychological impact of abundance itself. Many prisoners experienced what might be termed a philosophical crisis, as their understanding of the conflict and their place in it was fundamentally challenged by their direct experience of American material capacity. The therapeutic value of this realization, though painful, may prove significant for post-conflict reconciliation. Private Morrison returned to Iowa in October 1946, his military service complete. He brought with him dozens of letters from prisoners, messages they wanted delivered to various parts of America, thank you notes to medical staff, to teachers in the English classes, to guards who had treated them fairly. Morrison spent months delivering these letters personally when possible, serving as an informal ambassador for reconciliation. In one letter he delivered to a family in Sacramento, a former prisoner had written, "I fought against your country for 4 years. I was prepared to die rather than surrender, believing that capture meant torture and death. Instead, I found that I was treated better as a prisoner of America than I had been as a soldier of my own nation. This is not the outcome I expected, but it is the truth. I hope in the future our peoples can find peace, because I have learned that we are not so different, only that we had different opportunities and different information." The camp at Angel Island processed over 2,000 prisoners before closing in late 1946. The facility was repurposed, the temporary buildings dismantled, but the impact of those months rippled outward in ways both documented and invisible. Years later, in the 1960s, during a conference on post-conflict reconciliation, several former prisoners who had gone on to prominent positions in Japanese business and government spoke about their experiences in American detention facilities. Their testimony revealed that for many, those months had represented a fundamental education in systems thinking, in the importance of logistics and infrastructure, in the possibilities of organized abundance. "We learned," one former prisoner said in a recorded interview, "that conflict is not primarily decided by courage or dedication, though these matter. It is decided by productive capacity, by transportation networks, by agricultural systems, by the ability to feed and equip millions of people simultaneously. This seems obvious now, but it was not obvious then. We had been taught that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. We learned painfully that in modern conflict this is simply not true. But we also learned that the systems that create abundance can be built and learned. This became the foundation for our own reconstruction." The story of what Japanese prisoners could not believe about American portions became, in time, a story about the recognition of systemic differences, about the transformation that comes from direct experience, and about the possibilities of rebuilding based on new understanding rather than old certainties. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.